Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture, our speaker, for the first of our annual speaker series here at the King's Wargaming Network. My name is David Banks. I am the Academic Director of the King's Wargaming Network. And I'm very happy today to introduce our speaker, Richard Milburn, who, as I said, will be our first speaker for our annual series. The theme for this year's series is the use of wargaming to study non-military forms of conflict, which is a shift from the usual topic that most wargames address, which is some form of strategic or operational or tactical level warfare, usually involving kinetic weaponry. Here, the purpose of this year's series is to try to look at the way that wargames are used for other forms of conflicts. And we are inviting speakers who have made important new contributions to wargaming, non-warfare or cross-disciplinary subjects. So I can see we have a number of people attending, and I very much appreciate that that those of you could make it, especially those who are joining us from the United States, because it is obviously Thanksgiving. So anyone who can pull themselves away from the table, that's very much appreciated. Let me take a moment here to introduce Dr. Milburn. Dr. Richard Milburn is a visiting scholar at King's College London's Department of War Studies, where he teaches an MA course in environmental security. He also directs the Marjan Center there, which researches armed conflict and the environment, utilizing what is termed, a war-first approach. This approach seeks to use a wider understanding of armed conflict and insecurity to identify the role that a loss of wildlife and biodiversity can have in contributing to insecurity, and making the case for the importance and utility of environmental protection to those in the development and armed conflict space. He also acts as the UK representative of the Pol Pol Foundation, a multi-award-winning Congolese conservation charity based in Bukavu, and is also co-founder of a social enterprise, Tunza Games, which uses gamification to engage people in conversation and raise funds to support conservation projects around the world. Today, Dr. Milburn is presenting on wargaming, environmental security, and climate change. And we'll talk about using games for environmental security, climate change, and countering the illegal wildlife trade in both practical field-focused work and classroom education. So I turn it over now to Dr. Milburn, and I very much look forward to hearing his talk. I remind everyone that those of you who have questions, please put them in the Q&A function here, not in the general chat, and then those questions will be addressed after the talk. Thank you very much, and I turn it over to you, Dr. Milburn.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. So I'll just share my slides. And can you just confirm they're visible?
We can see them.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so thanks, David, and to the KCL Wargame Network as well, and to Anna for putting this in and for the invitation. So yeah, I'm going to look at wargaming, environmental security, and climate change. So I just want to start really with the key takeaways from this presentation, what I'll try and get across. So as David sort of alluded to there, how useful or potentially not useful the war games terminology can have in terms of reaching that wider audience, and looking at how the same sort of processes can be used in different areas, particularly in an environmental context where you've got a lot of people who aren't particularly involved in the military or try to move away from war. Also making the point that gaming offers a very effective approach to engage people in environmental issues, and I'll talk about some of the ways we do that at Tunza Games, and then also at King's with some of the environmental security research and teaching there. And then also just a few more general thoughts about the utility of gaming and how to do it. So this notion that little and often is usually more helpful than massive and infrequent. So I'll just go through how we tend to design shorter, less than an hour games and use them as tools and sort of iterative play, particularly to get that multiple times opportunity to play games to really learn the lessons and test out strategies. And then also just kind of finish off, look at some of the limitations of games and things we need to be a little bit careful with, as well as the opportunities not only for people to play the games and learn and be engaged, but also using game design as a way to get people to better understand an issue. In the same way you're trying to get somebody to teach a topic to really understand it, if you get them to design a game about it, actually that can be really, really interesting and help them get into the heart of a particular issue, particularly in the environmental space, but elsewhere as well. So just a little bit more background to me, and then Tunza Games as well, the company through which we develop all these games. So had over a decade working researching mostly in the sort of biodiversity conservation space, primarily terrestrial conservation. So they focus on the illegal wildlife trade, protection of forestry, in war zones and post-conflict zones particularly, but also just more generally, certainly around the illegal wildlife trade, and then also climate change more broadly, and looking at the military's involvement in climate change, both the responsibilities and also the opportunities, risks associated with that. Most of the work is focused on conservation and illegal wildlife trade. That's sort of specialism, particularly the last 3 or 4 years, being both out in the field and also in a research capacity. So the initial reason for getting into game design about 8 years ago, probably now, was to make environmental education more fun and engaging. So that was the Tunza Games sort of ethos, that we're working on quite a few projects related to conservation education. A lot of them were very, very dry. They were very sort of consistent. It was all about getting those key messages and so on across, but in quite a sort of dull way, and also a lot of negativity. So it's the notion that a game can make it a lot more fun way to get people engaged. So that's how I got in, and then worked with a co-founder who had about 10 years experience in game design, actually then upskilling in terms of the actual mechanics and so on of game design, and getting better and better at that, and designing initially a conservation game, then rolling it over to a wider variety of games. So Tunza Games itself, a purpose-driven business. So we are a company that makes profit, but also it's profit for purpose. So really focused on delivering impact in both commercial and educational settings, and within the third sector with charities. And then the reason for the name, so Tunza means we care in Swahili. So really looking into a lot of the work we do, sort of African conservation, so it fits in quite well. And you can see the logo on that slide as well. So just initially to talk about that notion of the term war game and what it can lead to. So I was brought into a slightly bigger space around military war game related to climate change for a project down at Shrivenham last year, and brought onto a call, and the first call was with some of the UK sort of leading war game designers. And immediately when I got on and said, I don't do multi-day super complex war games, and I talk about this more, we do sort of 1 hour slots, so it might not necessarily fit that well. And in fact, the people on there were great. Said, that's not what wargaming is. Wargaming is a much bigger space and the opportunities for a whole load of different versions of what a war game is actually is where the real utility comes in. So you can have those massive military exercises, you can have the big military war games in the conventional sense of how we perceive the word, but also just the principles of gaming and building scenarios as a teaching and application tool are really useful. So I do think there's something to be said for looking at that war game terminology and either trying to come up with an alternative term that kind of speaks to a slightly broader usage of war games. I said, particularly in an environmental context where you've got a lot of people that would be pretty anti-war, to try and get that sort of message across can be quite effective. So just trying to broaden out what that means. And obviously this series is part of that process of taking it out of the military space and looking at how it can be used more generally. And the point that most gaming and wargaming is, it uses all the same sort of principles and everything. So there's not that big a distinguishing features between so-called war games and conventional gaming in many ways, and it can still be a very valuable tool. So looking at how we can get that used a bit more broadly. And then even gaming can carry connotations. So, does it have to follow particular mechanics, or actually just building some sort of scenario or role-playing exercise? Is that actually just classed as that is a game or war game or whatever? So there's a lot of utility within that, but the definitions can potentially sometimes blind people to that. And then equally, I've still had the problem that gaming itself can carry connotations that's perceived as almost too much fun rather than a really serious endeavor. So the wargaming angle or terminology gets over that, but then opening up a bit more to gaming, there's also that risk that it's perceived as just a bit too much fun rather than sort of professional game or useful resource. So I don't really have the answer for exactly how to improve that. I think probably two things. One is getting war games to be used more widely, so the term actually gets accepted as a much more broad field is probably the way to go, rather than trying to come up with a whole load of new terms, but also just trying to get gaming as a tool and a professional tool to be a bit better respected and utilised more widely. So just a consideration. So getting into the specific focus of this evening, so climate change, environmental security issues. So just look at some examples of gaming climate change and their utilities. So some of you may have seen the Financial Times climate change game that came out earlier this year. So it achieved quite a lot of traction. My WhatsApp was getting buzzed by a load of different people who'd seen it and then were sharing the link, seeing it as relevant to what I was doing. And then equally, when I was talking to other people about it, a lot of people had come across it and played the game. So a really good example of the potential for war games to be used to actually engage people in this space. So Financial Times had gathered a load of experts together, a big data pool, and then converted that into a series of decisions that people could make. So you logged onto the website and then chose, a question would come up, this thing is happening, what do you want to do? And then from those options, you would choose what you wanted to do. And then there were a series of stages through that. And then the result was how high emissions had gone, were you still in power as a politician? And also, I think, how your economy was faring. So, a really interesting thing to do, I think proved fairly popular. The only thing I found, and in conversations with other people who played it, the format was potentially a little bit restrictive. So it was quite a long process to play the game. I think it took sort of 15, 20 minutes. So even going back in when it's just questions that you can answer, and then, and there's sort of a tree diagram of decisions, doesn't necessarily pull people in to keep playing and replaying as much. Also, not the flexibility, you made a decision, this was the result, and that was that. So I think in some ways that's quite useful, that there's we predict these decisions will lead to X, Y, and Z, but particularly for people with a focus on one particular area, that can be quite frustrating. So when I played it, I chose a behavior change campaign, I think around meat and dairy, and the result was it was a failure because it was really badly designed, and therefore led to a lot of widespread unpopularity. Of course, I made the mistake thinking it would be a well-designed behavior change program, and some of the principles associated with that. So a few sort of decisions like that, or choices like that, it is quite restrictive in terms of the outcome. So that slightly limits the utility of the game, because it is so specific, but still, as the fact that a major and highly respected UK newspaper was producing this, not only about climate change but also gaming it to get people involved, I think is a really good example of the utility of gaming, and that more and more organisations are starting to realise that this sort of thing is necessary. And within an environmental space where for so long environmental activists have just been sort of shouting at people basically and telling them they must change, or you've got Just Stop Oil, getting widespread unpopularity by blocking motorways and so on. In fact, something a little bit more engaging that pulls people in and gets them involved is a really positive thing, and shows there's a lot more opportunities for doing that sort of thing. So there's a couple of examples of things we've done. So there was an Environmental Security Research Group, which is a research group within King's, not just the School of Security Studies, but wider throughout King's, of all academics interested in the space. So we were tasked with developing a project for them, which was an online game, which I'll come on and show you later. Just have a quick playthrough, which was a variation on a game we'd already designed, an offline game, so a paper-based game, and then also to move beyond just using games, getting people to play them to sort of understand the issue. We then had an ideation session, so trying to actually capture genuine outputs from the session that could then be used and integrated into policy making and decisions and so on. And it's something I've then used more at King's and other teaching as well, and with a couple of external organisations. So again, that notion is not just doing the war game or the game, and then potentially having a bit of discussion or trying to capture some of the results or the moves within the game. It's also then actually trying to capture, okay, what do people think based on playing those games? How does it then lead into potential decisions that they're going to make or thinking that they're going to have in future? So quite a good project. Initially started with a day down at Shrivenham. So you played the online game in teams, played the offline game in teams, then had lunch, then the ideation session was in the afternoon, and then captured the results. And crucially, it's designed as a tool that can be used anywhere. So the online game is just on a website that's free to access. The offline paper version is just a PowerPoint deck in PDF. So again, print and play. So anyone who's interested can take it on and use it. So I played it with students in King's. Some of them come back to me and said they want to play it with other friends who weren't on the module. So just send it out to them and then they can play. So designed as that tool, anyone can pick up. They've got the rules there, and then they can use it. And particularly zoning in on the different types of audience. So that project was designed primarily for military personnel who wouldn't necessarily have a great understanding or knowledge of climate change. So the games were designed to introduce them to the topic and some of the key decisions they made. On the day when we actually did it, we had a lot of non-military or sort of security sector personnel who were actually very, very well informed about the situation. So it sort of showed the game was designed more as an introduction, in fact, needed a little bit more complexity for those sorts of players. So again, brings out that interesting sort of notion around gaming of what level do you base your game at, and why it's relevant. I'll talk a bit more about that later as well. And then within the teaching that I do, we've done these climate strategy sessions, so talking about environmental strategy and how to actually solve climate change, and really getting into what the strategic vision looks like, and then tasking students in the seminar with taking on either a country or an organisation, whether that be King's College London or Extinction Rebellion or a variation on that, and then saying, okay, what would a strategy look like? So this isn't necessarily technically gaming or wargaming, but I'm not sure that really matters. It's a practical exercise which uses a lot of the underlying sort of principles and mechanics, and then gets a practical output. You're both applying the learning from the lecture and also testing that people have understood what was in the lecture, and also generally getting them to try and think of something practical to deliver. So the most recent one this week was an undergraduate module. So one team took on being Norway as a country, looking at their strategy, how could they have the biggest impact on climate change? So they decided the best way to do it was to use their sovereign wealth fund that derived a lot of income from oil, so that sort of social justice or environmental justice kind of notion, and then use it to fund a project to refreeze the Arctic, basically the Arctic sea ice. So even in the lesson, they were starting to get online, see what sort of potential there was, and trying to identify broadly what that might look like. So again, not necessarily a war game as such, but quite interesting in that sort of moonshot, blue sky thinking that they adopted, but also from quite a common sense approach, right? So just going into, okay, if the ice caps are melting, then why don't we just refreeze them? And then starting from that as a sort of question, and then looking at the viability of that, which I think is quite interesting as a strategy. Also had another group last year who took on what should an environmental activist group such as Extinction Rebellion or whoever, what should be the sort of core principles to achieve effect. So we talk a lot about on the course about the failure of the environmental movement really over the last 30 years. So although there has been some really great work and there've been some very inspiring people, climate change has got worse, ecosystems have been degraded to a greater extent, and more species are threatened with extinction. So although the situation would have been worse without their work, is also we need to judge it as fundamentally failing to really prevent that environmental degradation. So this group, we're looking at how do you get an activist group to actually win popularity. So identifying that one of the key things is environmental groups need to become more popular to be seen as much better, more interesting people to then mobilize mass support, because XR and Just Stop Oil and the likes were just starting to annoy people. So they came up with this notion of 3 C's. So they should be compassionate, collaborative, and constructive in everything that they do. So compassionate, understanding the struggles that people face and trying to solve these problems, and trying to help them get through those problems rather than just sort of shouting at them. Collaborative, really trying to work with a lot of organizations to come up with solutions rather than just sort of going alone. And then constructive, always looking for solutions and making things better, even if not, the absolute perfect solution. So actually is this really simple sort of guidebook for how to improve environmental organizations' engagement with the wider public. I think that's really powerful. So again, not necessarily technically a war game in the conventional sense, but using those same sort of principles to come up with stuff that is genuinely useful. And now working with various elements of the MOD to try and get more of these sorts of ideas and thinking into that military space, not in terms of necessarily their communication with the public, but some of the work that students are doing and the outputs from both these gaming sessions and seminars, to then genuinely find a way to capture them and bring them into policy, which I think is also really interesting. So in terms of more focused on gaming conservation, so in their Conservation Crisis was the first game that we developed as Tunza Games. So it was designed, as I said earlier, to try and make environmental education and conservation education more fun, but also be educational. So genuinely teach people what's involved in conservation, give them a real insight into that sort of ground truth as much as possible from a game, but also make it fun to play. So it's a board game that is sold on Amazon and on our website, so designed for families to be great fun to play. There's also an online version and an app version, which is slightly more advanced or technical in terms of what goes on in the game, but still relatively straightforward. Pretty much anyone can play it. So trying to make it as accessible as possible by putting it online, but also making it accessible as a physical board game that people can play sort of in slow time. And then also designed as a fundraising tool. So instead of just asking people for donations all the time, say, okay, particularly around Christmas time or birthdays, anyone with an interest in conservation that would donate to a charity is probably going to buy a board game anyway. So in fact, if we can offer a game about conservation that's fun to play as well as educational, they can buy that game instead of buying another game. So it doesn't really make any difference to their sort of budget or expenditure, but money will then go to charity. And we're working with other organizations now on white labeling the game so they can actually, produce their own version and then keep all the profits as well. So not only that chance to engage and educate, but also a fundraising tool, which I think is quite interesting. And then some interesting lessons from this. So I think one of the big things that stood out, because this was really when I was first getting into gaming and game design as well, so about 8 years ago, as I said, when we started. So the particular utility of games to simplify an issue into its core thematic areas, and then also start to predict the future based on that from the past. So if you can identify trends or events and so on that are likely to happen and you put them in the game, that actually gives that predictive capability, which then makes the game, really useful tool. So the game, and I'll show it after this, takes what seems to be a really complex issue. How do you protect a national park wildlife reserve from all the multitude of threats and issues and so on that are around, and simplified it to around 10 sort of key decisions that you go through that bring out those core themes within the space. And what we found is it's both really good for new learners. So we might teach, say, a session on it, either a morning session or just a lecture. We'll then get people to play the game just to apply those lessons, and then quite quickly takes them through to getting a really good understanding of what it's like in the real world. So we've also done it for soldiers deploying on Corded, which is the British Army's countering the illegal wildlife trade operation. So delivered a session on what the illegal wildlife trade is, but then got them to break down into teams, take control of a wildlife reserve in this game, and then actually go through the various actions that they could take, which is much more engaging than just delivering a sort of lecture or presentation to them. Also gives a bit of choice about what to do, and then sparks quite a lot of conversation, and found quite a few soldiers just downloaded the game and played it a few times in their own time as well, just to learn a bit more. So again, a really useful tool. We've also done it with very experienced conservation practitioners out in the field, who's also said actually it's still, even for them, a really, really useful game. It just simplifies what they're looking at down into that environment, so they can sort of look at what their decisions are, and therefore, some of the challenges they may face and what they need to do, and also offers the opportunity to then introduce some extra cards, particularly in the physical game. They can bring extra elements into that based on their experience. So same underlying game can be really useful for people new into the space, but also for more experienced people, even if you add something in which is then useful. Also predicted the effects of the pandemic and how to negate them. So this was first published in, I think, 2016 or 2017. And there's a card in there that talks about a disease outbreak wiping out tourism for the reserve. So tourism is part of the sort of key source of income for conservation. So this was eminently predictable that some sort of disease outbreak or conflict or insecurity issue would just wipe out tourism around the park, and then conservation organisations would be left with no funding. So when the pandemic came along, that was very, very predictable what would happen. Had the strategies been put in place and the things that were in this game being put in place, the impact of that pandemic would have been massively reduced on conservation. Instead, organisations weren't ready, they didn't have reserve funding, their income dropped, and then poaching and deforestation rates increased as a result. So also I think that's a mark of a really well-designed game as well. Same with well-designed analysis. You not only look at what's going on and what's been happening in the past, but you also develop that predictive capability. And obviously in war games, you're looking at that, what's going to happen in the future. So that's a really, really important part. Also identify some lessons about the value of online versus offline games. So I usually use the online game in educational environments just because it's much quicker to play. So, offline game, everyone has to unbox the thing, read the rules, learn how it all plays, set everything out and so on. So it takes quite a lot of extra time. The online game, everything's set up, everything's done, you just move around. So, that's quite useful. But crucially, only where Wi-Fi and the technology to do that exists. So our games used around the world, particularly in Africa, on various education programs. So some of those organizations will come back to us and say, actually, they don't want the online version because they just don't have the technology to deliver it. So they actually want that physical copy. So quite an interesting sort of relationship there between where it's useful. The online stuff has to be coded, and then once you've designed it, it's then fixed. So it's more limiting with what you can actually do. And it also highlights an important consideration. If you're going to put something online, how do you keep as much flexibility in the design as possible? So for our game, we have a back-end system that enables us to change the wording on the cards and change the result of the cards. So even though the game itself is coded and fixed in terms of the moves that can be made, there's still a fair amount that we can do to vary what's actually in the game, or if a particular theme or event happens, we can quickly integrate that into the game for players to utilize. And also, even if it's conversations after playing, if somebody says, well, I think this should happen or that should happen, we can actually include that within the game. That's built into the coding framework and how it's designed. We had a really good developer working with him to make sure that existed. So that then makes gets you much more reach. Same with like the Financial Times game. Once it's online, loads and loads of people can play it. It's free. They just go on and play. So that does have the advantage, but also once you've coded it, you're then restricted in the changes you have. The offline game, in contrast, you can just throw in a new card or a new rule whenever you want, depending on the teams you're playing with, or so on and so forth, and you can get players to introduce those things as well. So there is also that advantage of the physical games, and I think particularly when you've got more time to go through these things, actually the offline games can be really valuable because of that, because it does just give you that much greater flexibility. So smaller groups face to face with more time, then we'd usually go offline. Whereas if you're trying to deliver that reach, say to engage people with an environmental issue, then actually the online capability is really, really valuable. And then, lastly, the value of the underlying game structure. So we've developed quite a few different versions of conservation crisis games. So we've got different conservation ones. We've got 2 climate change versions. We've got a humanitarian version. We've also got a counterinsurgency version. So using the same sort of structure, we know the game works. We know how all the mathematics within it and so on work, and the links between the various actions and mechanics. So having understood that game, we're then able to use the same underlying structure and put a new face on it with a new theme, which then becomes really valuable because, as many of you on here will no doubt know, game design takes a lot of time and potentially money as well. So if you've got to constantly design a new game every time you're coming out into a new thematic area, that potentially makes gaming actually too expensive and too difficult. If you've got those underlying structures, though, that can be white labeled into a lot of different themes, that gives the opportunity for these games and tools to be used a lot more. So really valuable option, and virtually every game that we design as a company keeps that in mind. So it's designed to develop an underlying structure that we can apply to multiple different issues, partly just to make them more useful, but also our offering is to organizations, we can design games for them in a much quicker and cheaper process because we've already got the underlying framework. So we can go into a meeting and say, look, this is a game we've already designed. This is roughly what it will look like for you. These are some of the changes we'll make. Are you happy with that? And then you get that agreement out. So again, quite useful, and particularly in an educational setting as well, being able to just create a pool of resources that any teacher or instructor can just bring in, adapt themselves, and then use. Makes the whole process a lot easier, and the opportunities to use gaming are then a lot bigger. So just to try and bring this through, I'll try and show you the game itself online. So David, can you just confirm you can see the game now?
We can see it.
Yeah. Okay. So just talk you through it. So this is Conservation Crisis, the online version. So initially, you pick a task card. So again, just trying to get what people would think about. So in this case, we'll just focus on employing as many staff as possible. So you choose that card. And then you've got various sounds and so on. But really, this is what I was talking about with the key themes within that conservation space. You can see there, employ vets, that sort of process of conservation needs to deliver that medical support if an animal's injured, caught in a snare, or also just and assessing wildlife health. Those vets and scientists are really important. Running a breeding program, sometimes quite controversial in the conservation space, but the notion also of reintroduction from orphanages or from other reserves as well. So translocation comes into that, so that's the opportunity. And then running livelihood schemes, this notion of poverty being a key driver of poaching and deforestation. So actually you need to provide support to communities, dig a watering hole and sort of fits into the whole restoring ecosystem. So just helping the natural area develop its or redevelop its natural capacity. publicity being really important in terms of how do you raise money and do you stop and take time to do that. But then also included a poacher's checkpoint. You can see there the bribe card. So you either have to choose to wait at the poacher's checkpoint or just to pay money and go straight through. But then you take a bribe card and you see the consequences of that. But then here you've got both luxury lodges and then further down backpacker hostels. So ecotourism is such a key part of the economics of conservation and is the primary means of generating revenue for conservation. So that's in there that if you're running reserve, you need to look at investing in tourism to generate revenue. But as cards come up, also that can have problems. Then you've got community and staff meetings. So again, cards come up and just tell the story, hire rangers, build wildlife fences to overcome human wildlife conflict, rangers to stop poachers, schools because education is so important. And then if I highlight this, oops, sorry. Let's get rid of my screens. So yeah, sorry, it's slightly cut off here. So up here, you've got $100,000 of funding, and then you've got a $25,000 crisis fund, and then also your wildlife population. So within this game, players get $100,000 per round in donor funding, grant funding, but at the same time, they have to spend that by the time they get back to HQ. So you go all the way around the board. You must have spent all that money by the time you get back to HQ in order to get another grant. If you don't spend all the money, you don't get another grant. So just highlighting some of the challenges that charitable organizations are faced with, but they're not able to just keep hold of money and then keep using it. They have to spend it. So it just highlights that as a sort of educational tool and, you know, a restriction that these organizations face. There's also a crisis fund. So in the same way we have savings, it's been identified through a load of research and you know, also just seeing the events in recent COVID pandemics and so on, that organizations need their own reserves so that if they have a loss of grant funding, they're still able to survive. So any leftover money can be put into the crisis fund, but only up to $100,000, again, with sort of restricted funding and so on. So for this sort of thing, players just move around. So you might move to community and staff meeting, you take a card, read what the card is, and then you may get it. So if you had a school, you get 10 wildlife, for example. Then you carry on to say employ vets, hire a vet, you get when the money goes down, then go to the poacher's checkpoint, and so on and so forth. You wait until we're released because you don't want to pay the bribe in this case, and then you carry on round. So that's just a very, very brief introduction, but I'll also now show you what we did for the environmental security research project. So same underlying framework, and this was basically to look at how with virtually no budget could you take an existing game and then just focus it on climate change as opposed to conservation. So again, same sort of task card, but our back-end system enables us to rewrite what these cards are and the consequences. So in this case, we'll look at, the security situation being faced. So in this case, we've got peacekeepers instead of rangers. So still the same sort of locations on the map. So where we had rangers before, we've still got the same icon, but in this case, it's deploy peacekeepers. We've also got focused on solar power as a source of revenue, either a micro solar power grid or a big photovoltaic power plant. Obviously, some of the imagery around here, because the budget was so small, there wasn't the cost or the budget for new graphic design. So we've just kept the same sort of underlying area, but looking at a province that is at risk of insurgency. So you've got the sort of urban areas down in this left corner, and then also into the more green sort of forested areas above. But you just go through the same processes, in this case, restore ecosystem services, move around, spend the money, and so on. And you've also got, in this case, an insurgent checkpoint instead of a poacher's checkpoint, and the same sort of bribery issue. So again, just an example of the games we use and how we use them, or how they can be used to get some of these messages across. So yeah, then just some sort of thoughts on how to most effectively use games. So particularly one around game length, which I mentioned at the start. So we very much focus on games that take less than an hour to play. So again, this focus of little and often. So as I was taught by Graham Longley Brown, this was his way of thinking, which I think is exactly right, that although you still need the really big games, complex games, multi-day games, big military exercises and so on, actually the real utility of gaming, particularly early stages within a topic, is just little and often. So getting that ability to apply what people have learned within a relatively simple environment, and also having that ability to replay the game. So you're not just doing one exercise, massive approach, play it once and then sort of walk away thinking you know all the answers. You've actually got that opportunity to replay it multiple times, try out different strategies, and so on and so forth. As talked about already, that online versus offline, the speed and the opportunities that online often can be a lot quicker. So when we're developing something offline, we try and keep the rules relatively simple, a few sort of key decisions or you know, roles that people adopt, and then they push on. And it gives that ability for a human being to test a load of strategies out, you know, in the same way that a computer would crunch data, by being that little bit shorter. And it also then fits in, particularly within an educational environment, either to sort of 1 hour seminars or 2 hour lecture seminars, or, you know, morning sessions or whatever, from an education perspective. Not to say that longer games can't be useful, you know, they can be absolutely fantastic and obviously form a key part of certainly how the military uses things, but a lot of organizations getting into that real big level complexity, but also those risks that people play it once and then think because they were successful in that one game that they'll therefore be successful in real life as well. And then as the game gets longer and more complex, the risk of just incorporating so many biases from the designers, or, you know, just sort of integrating groupthink into that game also raises. So you know, our sort of approach, if we're doing something longer, so we have designed some of this like 4-day exercises, we try and keep the rules as flexible as possible. So it might just be we provide a few injects, and we give people a broad role, but then we just have people on site who understand what the game's all about and then can direct it. But we give players as much freedom as possible to engage in that, rather than trying to set out too many rules or make the process too prescribed. And having been involved in a few military exercises as well, there's often a very, very clear sort of order of events, what will happen, when it will happen, and go through, which can be great as a training aid and to get some key points across, but also restricts the ability of that sort of real life influence. So also the sort of wider lesson we have is when we're engaging with public or with people coming into a space early, we try and keep it short and sweet, just get a game, get them thinking, get them using the game. If we're working with more detailed practitioners, people with a lot more experience and expertise, we'll try and do something a bit more complex and really get their expertise into it to design. So some quite useful rules of thumb. And then particularly related to climate change, we've developed a few games around climate change and different aspects of it. One mechanic we've used several times is variable temperature rise. So again, quite a useful element to have. We're not sure what the temperature rise will be as a result of climate change, where that will happen as well. You know, the north and south tend to be higher rises than sort of middle ground. It's a little bit more, a little bit slower. So actually being able to bring in that variation in how quickly temperature rises, and also introducing the potential that temperatures decrease, you know, for whatever reason, either because we actually get control of emissions somehow, or, you know, we introduce a mechanism that helps reduce the heat intensity of the sun onto the earth and so on, various sort of geoengineering perspectives. But also it enables some of these tipping points to be modeled by a sudden massive increase in temperature. So sometimes we make that visible. So in one game, it's a dice roll. So each die roll. So each number 1 through 6 is allocated either an increase, a decrease, or a no change to it. Players can see that when they're playing the game, so they know they can work out their own sort of probabilistic predictions and reasoning. But, you know, it's still there, and then they can sort of look at how the dice is rolled and so on. So it introduces quite an interesting mechanic. For that, it's a very short game. So it's a game that can be played in sort of 10-15 minutes, potentially even shorter. So you can play it within an hour, at least 4, potentially even 5 times. And each time you'll see the variations in the die roll and the temperature range, and therefore change your strategy. So it gives quite a good opportunity for that. In some of the other things, it's less visible. So we've got one which is a scenario-based exercise, which I'm delivering for my module as well, just bring it into that space in a couple of weeks' time. So that the whole back-end system is hidden in Excel formulas. So they're given the briefing and the information about what's going on, but they don't have the exact sort of detailed mathematical markers. So it's about making decisions in an era of slight uncertainty. Those decisions and then events that happen all get integrated through an Excel formula to then punch out what the result is. But again, so slightly just interesting ways of same broad sort of mechanical theme that we're working on, but just different ways of doing it, and how those results come out. The key thing with that is, though, you need players playing them multiple times. So the dice roll, say, you can play sort of 4 or 5 times within an hour fairly easily. The one focus around Excel, what we're doing is we get people to develop their strategy, they present that, and then we type in the values into Excel, and then we go through a whole series of different events happening, and therefore the different multipliers within the Excel formulas happening. So you're taking, okay, your overall strategy, you present that based on what you think is the best way to go in your different teams. But then we also are able to look at what different events, the consequences of those, and how effective that strategy would be under those different events. So that's where something like that Excel formulas can be really valuable, because instead of having to play the game multiple times for all that sort of stuff to come out, you just say, okay, what's your strategy? What are you going to do? And then everything in the back end is set up. And then you can test that strategy under a lot of different conditions just by putting, in our case, either a value of 1 or 0 against different events, and then that triggers all the multiplication. So, again, just another example of how this sort of stuff can be really, really useful and help people to model some of the stuff they're doing, even in a relatively quick and simple way. So gaming in education. So, I teach MA module at King's Environmental Security. I teach on an undergraduate lecture and do some other teaching and engagement work as well. So both in schools and universities and organizations. So one of the big things and sort of why we founded Tunza, again, was these sessions can often be a little bit dull, a little bit boring. Even if it's a really interesting session or a really interesting lecture, it's still very, very passive. So the games enable that to be brought to life and people to apply that learning that they've got from the lecture or from the education piece in whatever way it is. So it just gets people that bit more engaged. It's also a way to test that they've actually understood what was in the lecture. So I have quite a few times where I teach something, we then put in place the game, and you see people either they go into the mode of the role that they've been given, and they just zone in on that role rather than thinking about the bigger sort of environmental issues, or it gets to a certain thing and they just ignore what they've just learned in the lecture and just revert back to their sort of core thinking, what they're comfortable with. So it's also a good way to not only put that learning into practice, but also to check people are putting that learning into practice and start to challenge some of those assumptions. Time limitations is one of the big elements. If you've got a 2-hour session or a half-day session, gaming can be really, really useful, because you've not only got the chance to play the game, but you've then also got the chance to have an extended discussion. So you might have an hour seminar playing a game, you then want an hour to actually draw out the discussions and learnings and so on from that, and potentially even give people another chance to play it, towards the end of that. If you've only got a 1-hour seminar, or more constrained time, that can become a little bit more difficult. So it's just working out how to use that. Then there's online, offline opportunities. So, a lot of the stuff to do in an education environment will be offline, so, or a combination. But also, if you've got those online tools, you can give those to students either in advance of a session or after it, and they can go away and use them in their own time. They don't need, a group of people either to play them solo. You can just keep playing, keep testing strategies. So a good opportunity to keep that education going outside of the classroom. And then the last thing is actually trying to use games as a way to enhance learning. So getting people to design something themselves. So I know KCL has the Wargaming module, MA module. So they actually teach students how to design war games and then get them designing them. So that's sort of thing really useful. But even trying to do that in a small sort of sense, how do you get people just to design something simple at the end of a course and say, okay, you've looked at all these things, take an issue and just create a simple game, just to get that thinking and higher level of understanding. In the same way, if you've got somebody to teach a topic to show they really understood it, in this case, get them to design a game about it, can be really powerful. And we do that even on the bigger courses we've designed. At the end of them, it might be a 4-day exercise. We then, the 5th day is the feedback and lessons learned, but then also a few hours set aside saying to people, okay, design your own little scenario. So you've just done 4 days, but how would you actually design your own scenario, say within 2 or 3 hours? Just helps bring it all together. Then using games for change within the environmental space, also wider, but particularly focused on the environmental space. So this role that games can actually, particularly when they're done at scale and you can capture the results, can be that opportunity to identify solutions. So I think it was one of the football manager games, they had such good data on players that they'd sourced in order to build the game, that they're actually finding that was predicting players that would be really valuable in real life. So some of the big sides started going into the football manager, finding out who the most effective players were based on the data points that they put in, and then buying them on the cheap and then getting them as players and moving them up. So, that ability to put that data in and get loads of sources, get loads of playing that wouldn't necessarily be done in another environment can be actually really, really useful. And also that crowdsourcing approach, that if you've got a game there and you're looking at, okay, how are people playing this? Either to identify there's a commonality, maybe an element of groupthink, or everyone thinks one particular thing is the solution, you can understand why that's the option, or just having people play these different games and then seeing what they do, that can identify interesting approaches to solve the problem. And particularly when there's a bit more flexibility in how the games are played, that can be a really, really interesting way to do that. Also raising funds and engagement around environmental issues. So again, instead of it being activists just shouting at people and all the really negative sort of Armageddon talk, actually providing a tool and saying to people, okay, come on, play this game, get involved, see if you can solve the problem. A little bit more exciting, a little bit more engaging, and also the chance to raise money if if it's a thing of either pay to download the game, or at the end of the game, donate button comes up. An opportunity to raise some money, and also that opportunity that even if people aren't interested in the environment, if you can create a really good game about it that they just want to play anyway, then you can start to get people into it. Or even if you just got a very, very successful game, can you bring some of these issues into it either directly or slightly sort of tangentially, or through metaphor, can be really powerful. And potentially also deliver behavior change. So for example, you might have Call of Duty, do you introduce a new weapon system or a new camouflage capability, or a new level, and the only way players get access to that is that they prove that the electricity they're using to play the game is sourced from renewable energy suppliers. So you might not think games necessarily passionate about the environment, but if there is something they really want and you can open that up within a game in exchange for a more sustainable behavior, you then have the opportunity to use a non-environmental game to nevertheless deliver environmental behavior change, which is also quite interesting. I think Wendy's did this in the States, not about environmentalism, but they got people in one of these big world games, sort of Sims or whatever, to just go around destroying freezers, and then they could build up points if they destroyed freezers, because they were trying to advertise that all their food was fresh. So it became this sort of viral thing where people just went around smashing up freezers everywhere for a week or two. So quite an interesting way. It doesn't have to be an environmental game to engage people in an environmental issue, and arguably, in fact, what we need to do is design a lot more stuff that isn't in your face environmental or green, but can start to pull people in and get some of those messages. Most of the stuff we do is all environmental. That's just our sort of niche and focus. But in terms of those massive games where you're looking at tens of millions of players and so on, that's the opportunity to just use something a little bit more conventional, but to get that sort of message across. So similarly, gaming to engage. Environmental sector has been so negative and also so serious. This classic thing that even I get told a lot when I'm going to places, like, oh God, we heard you were into the environment and so on. We weren't particularly looking forward to you coming, and we were very, very skeptical about the pitch or the brief or whatever you give us. So there's a very, very sort of a lot of negativity around that outside of the sector. So actually an opportunity to try and change that perception and make things a lot more engaging, a bit more of a competitive element, and also make it fun. And then also that opportunity to just game out some of the key decision making. So for example, if you're asking people if there's one behavior change activity you want to invest in, what do you invest in, and why? Put your money in there and then see the impact that comes out of it. So you might say, okay, we want people to stop flying. This is a big thing. Oh, let's stop people flying. But actually, you put money into that, even if you're successful, which you probably won't be, you'll probably just annoy a lot of people because they like flying. They go to work and they go on holiday. So most people don't want to stop flying. So you say, the outcome could be you've put people off, so you've lost overall support for your cause, and also the change to emissions globally is only 2%. So in fact, in that case, it's simply not worth engaging in. So actually having something like that with those mathematical models that you can game through can be quite useful. And then also looking at how businesses can use games. So for example, putting in extra levels and opening them up, or even using environmental games where you get people say, if you play this game, you build up credit. Those credits can then be used like nectar points or whatever in Sainsbury's. So all sorts of really interesting opportunities that we're trying to work with organizations at the moment to get some of those in. Then one of my favorite things that I think is one of the most valuable elements, particularly from an educational perspective with gamings, is what I call an oh fuck moment. We try and include quite a lot of these in the games that we play, particularly in the educational context. So you've got that advantage that with a game environment, you've got a safe space you know, even if you go wrong, nobody's going to die. You're not going to lose loads of money. So actually, that's the opportunity to really try and nail key messages in. Because it doesn't matter if people fail. So if you can have that sort of thing where somebody makes a decision, they think they're going to go really well, and then a mechanic or whatever within the game just suddenly causes something really bad to happen, they're going, oh fuck, you know, I shouldn't have done that. And I realize, I know from my education, I really shouldn't have done that, but I did. That emotion that it sort of creates can be a very, very memorable tool. So I had this years ago, I was doing fighting in built up areas exercise. So I was defending team, trying to defend the hold. We were defending a building very, very effectively. We just, one section just been in and you know, we metaphorically killed them all, obviously all blank firing. And then I had to do a magazine reloaded the magazine, and then was lined up in a perfect firing position as the next lot of route came through the door. And I'd forgotten to forward assist the weapon, so there wasn't actually a round in the chamber, and I got dead man's clip. I can still remember that to this day. So ever since then, every time I was preparing or reloading a weapon, whatever weapon that was, whatever rifle or pistol, whatever, that always stuck in my mind, because it was that oh fuck moment. In one of our climate change games, we have that in terms of exploiting oil. So it's there's a 5-round game, and you know, you assign different, you can give commercial exploitation, disaster risk reduction, and so on. So one of the roles is your big oil, and therefore you're trying to make as much money as possible. But if you continue to exploit oil by the end of the game, which is looking out to 2050, you suddenly get this massive increase in hazard risk and crisis risk, and can potentially lose the game. So again, people sort of going through thinking, oh, you know, I'm just playing my character, but at the end they get the reminder that if we're still consuming fossil fuels at scale in by 2050, that's going to make the whole situation a lot worse. So that becomes a really memorable thing people take away. We've also applied it to PTSD games. So we developed something for a conservation space, but then just working with some people who, and around the sort of mental health issues and PTSD, impact of war and so on, actually worked out it could be integrated into a PTSD game. And again, giving some of those moments where, you know, you see behaviors and then you realize you really needed to intervene, because that it was a signal that that person was in a lot of trouble. So again, the opportunity to do that in a game, it still gives that emotional sort of thing, and people think, oh fuck, but there's no real sort of downside risk. And then just as come to the end, sort of looking at some of gaming's potential limitations, you know, it's not a panacea. So there is that risk that the games just codify groupthink or codify failure. So it's all very well having an environmental game, but if all the decisions are just the things we've been doing for the last 30 years that haven't worked, then it's not necessarily that useful. So there is that risk that you do just sort of entrench that groupthink and make it a bit restrictive, and the biases of the game designer and so on can be a problem. Or you get overconfidence in the result. You know, somebody plays the game, think, oh, you know, I was really successful in this game, and I played it 5 times and I was really successful. So I therefore definitely have the solution. Also understanding the limitations of games for real life, and need to both play that, then test different strategies, adjust it, and then just go again and again and again. The same way with military training, and you know, should be applied to wargaming as well. You don't just run a section attack once, say, oh, that was really good, and then stop. You're running it again and again and again, really getting those tools and that comfort, trying out lots of different approaches within an environment where no one's going to die if you go wrong, and then, you know, using that to develop your own capability, but also realizing it's still in a simulated environment. So you know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an absolute ninja when you go to war. If the games are too restrictive as well, they can prevent innovation. So it sort of forces people just to follow certain routes that might not necessarily be the most effective routes to follow. So trying to get that a little bit more flexibility into games can be very valuable. Equally, if there's too much flexibility, then you're not necessarily going to get those key messages and key decision points that you want to make people choose. So it's that balance and trade-offs within there, and also understand that these limitations can be a good thing, because those limitations or frustrations in the game can also spark innovation. So for example, I'm not very good at chess. It always frustrates me if somebody's better at chess than me, they're going to beat me. So it was a bit of fun. I tried coming up with some alternative rules in chess. You can just sort of throw in some opportunities to take a bit of risk, introduce a bit of luck that would potentially make a less skillful player more able to defeat a more skilled player, and also trying to make that relevant to conflict. You know, the notion you can occasionally take a dangerous course of action, which is high risk, but if it comes off, it can have a really big impact. So trying to introduce that in that case to chess, but you know, in a load of other places as well. And then also leading into that opportunity to use gaming for innovation. So we already talked about the opportunities for crowdsourcing, ideas and solutions. But that notion, if somebody's playing a game and just decides on a completely new strategy, that can be quite new. So there's an example from the Gulf War. I think it was the first Gulf War. DoD had developed a new computerized war game. So they brought in a bit of a maverick Marine brigadier to take on the role of Saddam Hussein. And he said he analysed the situation and realised he could not defeat Allied forces coming in. So he just fired off virtually every weapon system available. A theory being the only way possible to win was to give Allied forces a really bloody nose, so they lost the political will to fight, and then they would retreat. There was no other way to win. He was criticised for doing that. Then they reran the war game with somebody more conventional, and they won. But quite an interesting idea. Somebody, you bring somebody in, you create that space to say, okay, what could you do here actually? How can you think a little bit differently? I just did this week an environmental auction exercise / game. So one of the key drivers of environmental degradation and why climate change is happening is the economics. Say if you cut down a tree, you can monetize it. If you keep it standing, it's very difficult. So auctioning off these different assets, you had big farming business, minerals business, tourism, and then a conservation charity. So challenging those organizations, say, okay, how do you make the most money out of this ecosystem, but also how do you protect as much of the ecosystem as possible? What sort of trade-offs are there? So giving people the character role with a bit of structure, but then saying how do you innovate within that? The environmental sector particularly needs a lot of innovation. We've had 30 to 50 years of the same sort of approaches that, as I said earlier, just clearly haven't worked when you look at the data and you look at the effects. Although they were definitely better than not doing anything, they haven't, you can't actually define them as being successful. So we need that sort of innovation, and these games provide that safe space where you can fail and test things out. So a really useful way to do it. And then climate change strategy, as I talked about earlier, you can sort of start to run the numbers on this and then see what's genuinely the most useful. So that's my hour up. So just go back over those key takeaways. So right from the start, that sort of war games terminology can have negative connotations, or people think it's one thing when actually it's a lot broader. So potentially looking at how do we expand that sort of appreciation of what war games are and how useful they are in multiple different environments can be really useful. Gaming offers that opportunity to engage people in environmental issues in a really much more fun and competitive sort of way, and come up with new solutions and innovation. And then also to apply the learning, so you don't just talk at people, you also get them to apply and check that they are applying it, and create that space for innovation. Our approach certainly is that little and often is more helpful than massive and infrequent. You still need those really, really big war games and big scenario pieces. That there's clear utility to those, and history showing the value of them. However, just getting little and often into the space as well gives that opportunity to keep applying the learning and that space for innovation and so on as well. And playing a game once is useful, you apply the learnings and so on, but actually if you can get people playing multiple times, then it becomes exponentially more useful. They get to understand the issue a lot better, try out different strategies, understand how everything fits together, and that can be really useful. And then finally, there are some limitations of games. We can't see them as a panacea and need to be aware of that when using them within the environmental space or any space. But also those opportunities to get people to play them, to get that innovation, to get that applied learning, and then also finally getting people to design games. So even if they don't have a huge amount of knowledge in game design, just the process saying, okay, you've played a few of these games, you've seen broadly what is there. Either here's a few resources, like you've got 10 cards and 2 dice, an A4 piece of paper, just design a game based on this theme, or helping them a bit more with a bit more detail and so on. That can be a really, really useful way to check that somebody's understood a topic, and then can apply it in an even more effective way by developing those games and then developing that sort of detailed understanding of the issue. So thanks very much for listening. And then if there's any questions, I'll hand back over to you, David, to control that process.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. I think you really gave us fantastic insight into the quite different ecosystem of the way that war games are being used in the non-conflict or the non-traditional conflict space. And also thanks a lot for walking us through your games, because it really helps to put some actual kind of meat on the bones of what you're saying. So we've tons of questions here. So hopefully we'll be able to get through all, or at least most of them, in the short time that we have. But I think you sparked a lot of people's thinking here. So I'm going to start with one here from Galila. which is what challenges do you see in gaming real world scenarios, cases of ongoing conflict, for example, where outside knowledge about current affairs is involved versus constructed scenarios bound by the game design? So what's the challenges and trade-offs you see in those two approaches?
Yeah, so a bit like what I talked about. So I think partly it's the risk is just in reaffirming that groupthink in that sort of space, right? So I think that's where the game design sort of comes in, that you can design a game, you can get people playing it, but then you also want to give the space for people to take a game like that apart. So if there is that worries of, is it, particularly where there's external knowledge set against on the ground knowledge, and there's that sort of competing environment, or there's a belief that there's a sort of common conception of what this looks like, whereas actually the ground truth is quite different. There's still a utility in either both sets of people or organizations, whatever, designing their own game and then comparing the two, or having a game, as long as there's that opportunity to punch holes in it. So it's not just the case of just playing it or just designing the game. There's also that opportunity for people to discuss, say, I don't think this is actually what's going on. So, when we ran that event down at Shrivenham for the Environmental Security Research Project, we specifically gave people the opportunity to criticize the games and say, okay, what did they think? What else should be in there? What shouldn't have been in there? And how useful they were. So, I don't think it's necessarily, you can't always stop those risks from happening. There's always going to be that sort of competition. It's more designing in the time and the opportunity for people to get those differing views across, either in that critique or in different designs of the game, and sort of comparative approach. And to me, that should always be a part of the game design. So when I'm teaching at King's and design something, I always say at the end, this is a simplified version of the real life, and I'm encouraging students to pick it apart even through the process of the game stage. So what are the limitations? Is this the real thing? Like in the environmental auction exercise, one of the things I say to them is, you can challenge me. So the values that are down there, or the reasons, you can just come and pitch me a new idea if you think it's more relevant or more realistic. If you pitch, if you convince me, we'll just change the rules within the game. So it's something to be aware of, but I think also it's more of an opportunity to then get that discussion going, and starting to really sort of get both sides talking to each other and critiquing it.
Okay, interesting. There's actually another question here just a little bit further down, which is kind of, I feel like you've sort of answered it a little bit, but I'm just going to push you a little bit further on. It's from Evan. Given the highly complex and multidisciplinary nature of climate change, do you find that free Kriegspiels are better than semi-rigid games like a Matrix game for capturing the complexity, or the reverse? At what point do you find that the complexity becomes so overwhelming that people shut down?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely where it comes into designing shorter and simpler games. And there's, as identified there, certainly with climate change, there is a massive risk that you literally just codified groupthink and there's no real way around it. And we're looking at predictive capabilities as well. So it's quite difficult. So what we try and do is just break down elements of climate change into slightly simpler parts and then game each of those. So, the 1 hour war game specifically focused on climate change, there are 4 things you can do. So there's disaster, risk reduction, there's sustainable development, commercial development, the deployment of peacekeepers within a particular space. That's obviously a radical oversimplification of all the different options, but it's just quite a useful tool, and some of the trade-offs to bring into that space, then becomes quite useful. So yeah, that notion of kind of breaking down some of these issues becomes really important. And I think also when you've got an issue that is that complex and there's so much going on, the human mind can't process that in any really meaningful way. So in the strategy sessions we do, we really focus on saying, okay, let's zone into this. Instead of all this talk about, is it electric cars and the whole supply chain process that goes into the challenges, what is climate change in its simplest form? If you were going to explain this to a 7 or 11-year-old, or if you were given $100 billion and said, you can only do one thing, what do you do? And that actually then starts to become really, really interesting. So in that sort of complex environment, it can be more useful to say, just pick one thing. So in terms of the development of the strategy, teams have to pick one goal where they can deliver the biggest effect, and then try and work out what the key solutions in there. And this is where I think even the sort of the matrix style, or the Excel, the sort of tree diagram and everything can still be quite useful, where we use imagery, put it up and say, okay, what do we need to do to climate change? What in essence is the problem? So we just put a graph up that shows where the emissions come from. It's about 72.5% is energy.
Mhm.
So for all the discussions around what climate change is, 72.5% of it is energy. Then you start to break that down through another graph and look at where it comes from. You start to see, okay, well, actually climate change is really two core things. One is, how do you create a huge abundance of cheap, reliable, clean electricity? You know, that then can transition industry and transport and so on away from that, reduced carbon emissions. And then the second thing is, how do you increase carbon sequestration? So the Earth's natural ability to absorb carbon, to reduce overall emissions and suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and also technological solutions, which also rely on clean electricity. So by taking this massive, massive, super complex issue and saying, look, we can't deal with this, let's really, really zone in and simplify it into something that we can do if we only had, you know, 100 billion or $10 billion in one thing, then actually that starts to be really, really useful. So as I say, we don't design those super complex games around there, because although there's utility, you almost just, you're going to entrench so many restrictive views and so on. So in fact, just looking at simplifying and saying, let's take that complexity and just zone it in on 2 or 3 things. That's the way we approach it anyway, to, you know, to try and really sort of drive progress from it.
Okay, just building off that, a design question here from Nicola. What data do you use for the Excel model? I presume it's Excel model used to output the consequences of people's inputs. How do you validate this? So you know, what are you putting into that? Where are you getting this data from?
Yeah, so it's not, we're not using specific quantitative data to build that. We're taking the qualitative analysis and then assigning values to it, and then varying those values through the Excel process. So I don't want to give too much of this away, because I think some of my students are on this call tonight, and then we're taking it in the next 2 weeks. But broadly, there's certain key multipliers. So for example, one of the opportunities is, how much do you invest in innovation, and therefore what's the yield? So in those cases, we just put in variable yields. So, and that's based on various events happening. So, you know, innovation by its nature, the investment into it is quite high risk. You're not sure what will come out. So you might not get very much out, but you might get a huge amount out. So we just take fairly simple values in that and say, okay, either your innovation delivered, you know, X times 1.5, and then, you know, that's the result. Or if a particular event happens, then actually it delivers, say, X 3.5. So we're not really zoning in on the detail of exactly what those numbers should look like. We're more taking we've got 100 resources that can be expended, and then we're relating them to what, you know, what does your score then get? So, you know, like one of those classic tables where you index at 100 and then you either go down or up. That's how we sort of work in this space. Again, just to simplify it down, because the minute you start getting to all that big complex data, it can almost create as many problems as solutions. We're not looking specifically at the detail, we're looking more at the strategy. And then, yeah, just really assigning numbers to what we think could be those outcomes. But then also we're giving students the opportunity to challenge that within the space. So looking at how different strategies work and saying, okay, that's the multiplier, but do we think that's the correct multiplier? Do we think those are the correct values? So it's not about having the right values based on, you know, incredibly detailed interrogation of IPCC reports and so on. Although there is clear value to doing that, we're trying to go with a simpler sort of approach, top level strategy about what are these sorts of decisions. So even from a military perspective, looking at the predicted needs, so you can even take that as, you know, 2% of GDP in the size of military and so on. But actually, if certain events happen, what will be the expenditure result? So, you know, what would, say, the cost of a deployment in Afghanistan set against conventional budget? So you can use some of those things as sort of finger in the wind elements. Then you put that multiplier in if something happens. But yeah, in terms of how long it takes to design and the value out of it, we try and keep it that little bit simpler, and then have that discursive element about the game for students as well. So it's not saying this is definitely the solution. It's saying this is a model. All models are wrong in some way, right? But how good is this model? And then that sort of sparks a discussion. Right.
Well, so on that, so there's a question here from an anonymous, which is on applying learning. And this gets to this learning question you're talking about here is, do students take away more from designing or playing games? Or how does this differ, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think I would suggest from designing them, you know, to me, that's the higher level of learning, but they also need to play them first, right? So it's a step-by-step process. So in my view, it's almost the sort of 5 in 1 notion. So you want somebody come in, learn the stuff, play 5 games about it, see the different opportunities, different mechanics, and then they design one game on the back of that. That to me is a sort of rough ratio. So yeah, I do definitely think you learn more from the design, because then you're really zoning into it. So you need to decide within, say, take the climate change issue, there's all this stuff you could do. What's genuinely the most important elements, and then how do you model them? So going back to the conservation game that I showed, I've had sort of 15 years in the sector. So designing that game was phenomenally useful. So there's all this stuff going on, but what are the sort of key thematic areas? What are the really, really important decisions that in 90 to 95% of the national parks around the world are being made? The details on the ground will be different. What human wildlife conflict looks like between a tiger and an elephant is different, and the solutions are different, but the principle is the same. So that game design process can be really, really useful in terms of zoning in on what are those key themes and principles, and then driving into that. Equally, though, you need to have played games in advance to understand how those things work and apply the learning and so on. But in the same way that teaching a topic is more useful to learning and entrenching that learning and making yourself understand it than just being taught it is. So I would say designing a game is the same process as teaching is to learning, as design is to play.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting analogy. If games are played online to reach a broader audience, would you have suggestions for reflection or after action reviews to guide the learning experience? And would that take the shape of a facilitator kit or guiding documents with the game itself, or what?
Yeah, so actually this is something we've been looking at, is trying to get the games to deliver a bit more. So it needs a fair amount of thought, and also requires quite a lot of the time a bit more resource, which can be part of the problem, right? If you're given a limited budget, you can design the game, but if you then really want to make something useful on the back of it, it could be a little bit more difficult. So in our education packs for schools, we'll have the game, but then we'll also have student-led discussions, teacher-led discussions. So some key questions for students or pupils in this case, particularly when it's in schools, to be asked and then to discuss. So it may be an online tool that goes up there, but then there is guidance on the back of that to do it. One project we were going to do, we started work on it just before COVID. Then obviously COVID came in and wiped out loads of work. I'm sure everyone's experienced that. But that was actually looking at a national competition. So getting people to game a particular issue, having some resources about the themes that they learn, and then actually challenging them to come up and submit a solution to a particular problem. So for example, let's say it was around human wildlife conflict, to take that example again, saying to them, okay, you've got elephants coming in and destroying people's crops and so on within a national park. How would you solve this? Go away, do some research, do some thinking, and then come back with a couple of slides on what you think the solution would be, either a drawing or a practical process or some technology or tools that could be used to apply it. So, you might have camera traps or, image, almost like CCTV, but thermal imaging cameras linked to an AI system that can identify when an elephant crosses a particular area, and then it sends a buzz to people's phones, right? That could potentially be a solution. So in that case, you're getting the game, you're getting people to experience the sort of situation, get into it, so they understand the problem, and then you're giving a specific task to them afterwards to come up with a solution. The issue around that is you then just need the resource to evaluate that solution. But this is something I'm having a conversation about this morning, in fact, with another organisation, about doing just that sort of approach to saying, look, we can get this stuff up. If we've got the resource, let's get people submitting solutions on the back of it, and we can evaluate them and see the utility of them. So yeah, either a combination of just setting questions and things to think about if you haven't got that much resource or whatever, it's just quite a static approach, or actually trying to design something specific. So that Environmental Security Research Group project, there was an ideation session afterwards, so 2 games and then a specific process to get discussion and capture those ideas and then try to take them into a policy space. So it's all doable. It's just thinking, do you have the resource, do you have the time, and then how are you going to capture and action whatever the outputs are? That's generally the difficult and expensive bit.
Okay, all right. A question here about the impact of games. Could you elaborate on the predictive value of games and how to take insights forward?
Yeah, so I mean, for example, the sort of COVID example. So if you go through the game, particularly the online game, because all the maths and everything is done, and some of the cards are a little bit more harsh because it's not as family friendly. It's more for education. There were events that had happened in the past that were then, and the consequences of them were eminently predictable. So the game didn't predict that the pandemic would take place, or that was possible. But there were events that we knew could happen, and there were vulnerabilities that can be identified from the research and from practical experience. So it's about integrating those things into the game and then creating mechanisms where all of that sort of stuff can take place. So in the same way, if you're doing a conventional war game, you're looking at, okay, well, what is the enemy most likely to do, or how is this situation going to develop? You're looking at, okay, what's their doctrine? How have they operated in the past? Are there any particular units or generals or commanders who think in a slightly different way? And then you're trying to model that into the game and then get them going. So that can either be done through just putting rules in place that reflect that, and then giving the space for events to happen, and then therefore you see what would likely come out, or it can be about giving individuals a sort of framework, like a character card, and then saying, okay, these are your sort of core principles that you follow, but think, what could you do with this? So the classic sort of notion of red teaming exercise, right, where you say, okay, this is broadly the issue, this is your kind of some of your limitations, but what could you do if you're going to be really, really different around that? So I think there's different ways of doing that, certainly within a conservation or sort of environmental space, because the same stuff's been going on for 30 years, or in some cases longer. You can get to a point where you're fairly likely to predict what's going to happen. So Just Stop Oil emerging was an eminently predictable effect, right? There was going to be some sort of activist organization. They wouldn't be a terrorist organization. It'd be middle-class people who were frustrated with the sort of XR conventional, and therefore tried to do something a little bit, less conventional, that would be annoying, potentially illegal, but within certain bounds. So you could have designed a game around that space that said, okay, you're UK policymakers, what change do you want to happen? What changes, what decisions do you decide? Those are the multipliers, and then that predicts that another, if you don't hit certain things, then there's a predictive capability that says a new activist organization will emerge. We don't know exactly what they're going to be like, but we can assess under these conditions that happens. So it really comes back to that notion of, game reflects the analysis, right? So good analysis, you identify what's gone on, but you also then say, okay, we think this will happen. There are these key indicators and warnings, and also some key variables that will decide what's likely to happen or not. If you put them then into the game, as you play the game, that predictive capability of the analysis should come out through the game sort of framework, really. And then there's also that interesting stuff if you go big data, and that's where I think some of these bigger games can be really interesting, putting that data in and then creating ways for it to be used, like the Football Manager example. That's when you can get just really, really interesting solutions coming out. So they did the same around sort of the butterfly effect in a cricket game. So they slightly changed the values of different batting and bowling capabilities for cricketers in a game, and the results were wildly different, even with the same algorithm going through. So that enabled them to actually identify what some of those sort of key mechanisms were. So it's really just a good game reflects good analysis and structural elements. So then as you play it and put in various values or decisions, you then get some sort of predictive capability out of that game.
Okay, well, there's two questions here related to that. I think you may have answered this first one, but just tell me if you think you have. Do you find that interconnected risk can be explored meaningfully within a thematic game? And if so, how? I wonder, I'm not sure if you've got more to add on to that. I feel like you've answered a lot of that already, but if there's anything else you want to say on that.
No, I think just with it, that with something like that, you can either have the sort of Excel where you just have those multipliers, which becomes interesting, or you need to think about the flexibility to then allow changes to it as well. So even if those things would happen, there's a risk somebody could say, well, hang on, I could have intervened here, but the game won't let me. So it's just where the more complexity that comes up, the more flexibility you need to give players to intervene. They identify something's coming and then can change it.
Okay, that's interesting. That actually relates to another question, and I'll get to in a second. But before we get to that one, I'm kind of going a little bit out of order here. I'm trying to keep them thematic, because it's your one about education. This one's from Fionn. It says, educating everyone through an engaging game is a brilliant idea. How will a gaming approach to education affect the climate crisis? So I think, you've described how it might change people's understanding, but how do you think this might actually have a meaningful impact? Yeah, so I think in terms of, I view it as a way to improve education. So you can hopefully improve education around the issue, but equally, education really isn't really the problem related to sort of climate change, right? If people aren't aware that climate change is a problem by now, we're unlikely to sort of find a way. So I think that's when we need to switch much more into the practical implications and results. So that's where capturing ideas and solutions at the end of the game become really, really important. So you're using the game as a way to get people thinking and to get them, looking at what are the really, really important things we need to do. So for example, let's stop trying to stop people flying. That's a complete waste of time and is actually losing
support and has virtually zero impact on global emissions. Let's instead focus on the really important things. So that's where the sort of game element can have, even from an education perspective, of saying, look, everyone's talking about flying, all the environmental activists are, ignore that, it's rubbish. Focus in on this really important issue. How do we generate a load of very clean, cheap, reliable electricity? That's what we need to focus on. So the game can help do that in terms of the educational space. The key thing then is creating an enabling environment so that people that play the game can then actually go on and do something practical from that. So either come up with new ideas, new policies, new potential approaches, new innovative thinking, and then get that through to policymakers. So like with Kings, we've got this hackathon, Greening Defence Hackathon coming up next Thursday as part of a pilot net zero degree module within war studies. So 100 students are saying, reduce your emissions down to 6 tons. If you do, the department will offset your emissions, so you get net zero. But then you also, with the videos and stuff you've seen, you then need to come into the hackathon and try and work with an organisation to solve some of these problems. So again, that notion, in this case, it's videos, not a game, but similar sort of approach. And a lot of the students have played some of these games. To say, look, we've given you some of the core information about what's going on. Now we need to actually go in and solve it. So we've got guests from UK MOD Defence and also defence contractors. Some big defence organisations coming in to provide that support. So again, that's taking, people have learned this stuff. We've shown them what the really important elements are, and we also offer the opportunity to challenge what those important elements are, the group thing. Now we need to create a system to enable that change to happen. So I think games are just a tool to help that process move on. So maybe in terms of some of the solutions, you look at, okay, can we game them out to assess how useful they are? So it could be part of that, but I think it's a route into then delivering that practical impact at the end, that people are able to see what's happening and the consequences, see what really needs to be done through that mechanism, through the education and the gaming, but then they actually have to come up with something genuinely useful, practical, and deliver it. So it comes back to that earlier question around, how do you take a game and then also offer something afterwards about, thinking more deeply about it, or really trying to capture some of the solutions. Then it's not a problem. Okay.
And we have a few more questions. I hope we can get through we'll try to get through at least 2 or 3 more. Then we've got 5. I don't know if we're going to get through all 5, but I'm going to stack 2 together here, which goes back to something you said prior to the previous question about making sure players have these moments to intervene. So I'm going to put these 2 questions together. The first one is, how do you perceive the value of strategic pauses during a game? And if you see value, how is this incorporated into online digital settings? And then linked to that, I'm going to ask a question, which is, do you find that players respond differently in general to online versus analog games? And do you think that one is overall better for educational outcomes than the others?
I mean, the strategic pause, I think generally, very, very useful. It depends again on the length of the game. So if it's an hour-long game, potentially just play straight through. Your strategic pause then comes at the end, and that's your discussion, and then you play again. So that can be quite useful. I think if you're in a much bigger, longer thing, then absolutely having that time off, just let people clear their heads, think, critique, and so on, can be really, really valuable, and just sort of start punching holes in strategy and so on. Always taking that, the Condor moment, the classic sort of thing in a military context, is always going to be useful. And there is that danger, people just get so locked into either the exercise, the game, or whatever it is, that they lose sight of some of those bigger issues. So I think that's just a wider lesson from everything we're doing in life, right? It can get very, very easy to jump in. In terms of online game, obviously much, much more difficult to do that, because generally you are just playing through. But equally, it depends on the length of the game. So if it takes 15 minutes to play, that pause and thinking process can just come at the end. If you're on, say, a multi-day or super complex game, at that point you may need to introduce certain pause, even that's from one level to another in a sort of classic mass market game or whatever. It does offer those different challenges. And then online versus offline, which is best sort of, I think it very much depends on what you're doing, really. The online, the advantage, if the game is just built and people press buttons and things work, the potential for experimentation very, very quickly becomes bigger. With the offline stuff, you've got to teach people what it is, get them comfortable, so that can take a bit longer. But I think really it's about using both with all these things, right, and saying, okay, what budget have you got, what capability have you got, and therefore what's the best way to do it. But the online piece as well, I think the notion of developing something really good by putting it online, you can then let a lot more people use it outside of a conventional education environment as well. So there's that really big utility, whereas the offline stuff will generally need a bit more guidance and and so on and so forth. So yeah, really a combination of both.
Okay, just a few last questions. We've got one here from Iona, but I think you've answered it, where you asked, do you believe that students can benefit more if they play a war game developed by the instructor, or if they develop their own scenario and play it at their class? I think we can go back earlier in the recording and see that you basically think that they're better off designing if they had to choose one over the other.
Yeah, so I'd say play first,
yes.
Get used to the games, have that, but then, yeah, the ultimate is to then design after that. Yeah.
Okay, great. So just two more, and I think we'll hopefully get them in the time we have. You note a number of different types of games: education, change, engagement, innovation, etc. Do some of these require more in terms of research and rigor on the part of the designer than others? Why or why not?
Yeah, so I'd say definitely the more it comes into the educational space, the better it needs to be researched, because then you are genuinely, you are taking what you just presented or your research and you're seeking to apply it in a gaming environment. So that needs a much more detailed understanding of the issue, because it needs to have that, real academic credibility. If you're going for engagement, then there's a lot more flexibility, because a lot of that actually, it almost doesn't matter what's in the game. The key is, are you getting people into space, either to get them thinking about it or get them to do something related to it? And equally, it may be you're not even that interested in education. You just want a really fun game to engage people in an interesting way to get them to deliver behavior change. So at that stage, although understanding game design, all those sort of core principles become important, yeah, it's less important than how rigorous the actual game is. In an educational setting, yeah, you need to know a lot more. So yeah, that conservation game that I showed, designing something like that with very little knowledge could just create something, pretty unhelpful and very, very sort of superficial. So that detailed knowledge to get into the themes is really important, and to make something educationally useful and tied into what you're teaching as well requires that higher level of understanding. So I wouldn't go into a space, I do a lot of game design, so come to me with an issue about how to improve educational outcomes in a school environment. I'll just design a game on the back of that. I'd say, well, yeah, I can design you a game, I can give you the frameworks and the tools and so on, but I either need somebody to tell me what those key themes are through a discussion approach, or I'll need to go away and do a load of research to understand the issue. So yeah, the more it's focused on coming up with the right solution or reflecting real life, the more important it is to have that sort of deep knowledge. And I think as well, not just particularly for the real utility of gaming, is it's not just the theoretical knowledge, it's also integrating that practical real life knowledge. So that opportunity to say, okay, here's the theory, but also when you start putting that on, how does it work in terms of ground truth, you can integrate some really, really interesting learning that then brings some of that theory to life in a really interesting way. It might not be direct, it might be, you've taught this theory, then you say, okay, how do we apply this in a slightly different environment? But you still need to understand, in a lot of detail how that theory works to then design the mechanics and so on the back of it. And equally, if you're designing a game from scratch, you need to have practiced a fair bit game design, got good at it to create something. If you just come in completely fresh, you might pull it out the bag and produce something brilliant, but there's a bit more expertise sort of required. Whereas if you've got that underlying framework of a game and mechanics, and you've sort of seen how a few different games work, and you've got a really good understanding of the situation, you should then be able to create a game, even if you're not a game designer, but one that's still useful in an educational setting.
Interesting. Okay, wonderful. Last question. I know we're at time, but it is the last one. And it actually takes us all the way back to the very start of your presentation about the kind of difficulty around the term wargaming and the way it gets responded to. So I'm going to add an extra rider onto this. The question is, do you think wargaming is more or less effective in different parts of the world or not? And to that, I'm also going to add amongst different generations or not.
Yeah. Interesting, actually. Not something been asked before. So I think the core sort of the gaming idea is quite a universal concept. So even if you look at the history of chess, right, it went pretty much all through the world. So I think in some ways it's got that utility that most people will have played a game at some point through their lives, almost wherever they are in the world. So in fact, as a way to get some of this stuff across, it can be quite an effective tool. I say in some cases, the cultural dynamics can make it more or less effective. So if you've got a culture where, for example, leadership is not questioned, then a game environment isn't necessarily, you need to be very careful how you design that war game, because otherwise it can just create a lot of conflict. So if you look at the film Midway, the recent release, they give the example, Japanese commanders wargaming the US fleet. Two of the junior commanders move an aircraft carrier, secretly into a new location, and the senior commander kicks off saying, oh, you've not followed doctrine, this would never happen, and they get disciplined. So if you've got that sort of environment, which doesn't just happen in necessarily where it's a cultural thing, it can be, I've seen it in UK military, senior command say this is what we're going to do, and nobody else gets an eye in, sort of thing. So you still need to understand those sorts of elements and make it appropriate to those contexts. But I think actually, there's that thing of, because it's engaging, because it's hands-on, it then becomes really useful. So I was doing some work in Zambia where we use some of these tools, and it worked brilliantly because it just brought the issue to life. So because people have played these sorts of things, because it brings in competition, actually the sort of fundamental principles are going to be useful, I think, anyway, everywhere, or generally in a lot of different places. It's just understanding the cultural dynamics either of a particular nation or a particular organization, to see, okay, what are the potential barriers to utilizing certain types of games or mechanics or approaches within games that need to be considered.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Such incredibly comprehensive answers. Really, really interesting presentation. And I'm so glad that so many people had so many questions to you. So this is a great start to our series. I just want to thank Dr. Richard Milburn once more for everything he's delivered for us today, and remind everyone who's on the chat that there will be 2 more of these over the next few months. So please keep an eye out for those announcements. And for those who are interested, there's a recording of this as well. So thank you again to Dr. Milburn, and thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you in the near future.